She sat in that cold, sterile courtroom with her hands folded over her swollen belly, and she did not cry. She had made herself a promise the night before, sitting alone on the floor of the apartment she could no longer afford, with nothing but a single lamp and the sound of rain against the window, that she would not give him the satisfaction of her tears. Not in public, not in front of his lawyers, his mother, his perfectly tailored arrogance. She had already given Daniel Hargrove 3 years of her life, her career, her self-respect, and 2 miscarriages that he had responded to with silence and irritation rather than grief. She was not going to give him her tears, too. But as the judge read the terms of the settlement out loud, as the words primary residence, frozen assets, contested custody, and insufficient independent income filled the room like smoke, Maya Chen felt something crack inside her chest. Not her heart had broken months ago. What cracked now was something deeper, something that had been holding her together since the moment she discovered the truth about her husband, about his other woman, about the life he had been living behind her back while she decorated his home, attended his company dinners, smiled at his colleagues, and quietly buried the version of herself she used to be. 7 months pregnant, sitting in a courtroom, losing everything. And somewhere in the gallery behind her, she could feel Daniel's mother watching with that tight, satisfied smile she had worn since the day Maya first walked through the Hargrove family door. The smile that said, "I always knew you weren't enough for my son." What none of them knew, not Daniel, not his mother, not his expensive lawyers, was the secret Maya had been carrying alongside her child. A secret that would unravel everything. A truth so powerful that when it finally came to light, it would not just destroy Daniel's case, it would destroy Daniel himself. But that moment had not arrived yet. For now, Maya sat quietly, breathed slowly, and waited to understand how Maya Chen ended up in that courtroom. You have to understand who she was before Daniel Hargrove ever walked into her life. Maya was the daughter of 2 immigrants who had built everything they owned from nothing. Her father, James Chen, had come to the United States at 22 with $40 in a suitcase. Her mother, Lynn, had followed him 3 years later, learning English from library books and television programs, working double shifts in a restaurant kitchen while studying for her nursing certification at night. They were the kind of people who made their dreams out of discipline and sacrifice. They taught Maya that the world did not owe her anything, but that hard work and integrity would always, eventually, bring you to where you were meant to be. Maya had carried those lessons into her adulthood with a quiet ferocity. She had graduated, top of her class with a degree in landscape architecture, built a small but respected design firm by the time she was 28, and developed a reputation in her city as someone who transformed forgotten spaces into places of beauty and meaning. She was not flashy, she was not loud. She was the kind of woman who showed up early, stayed late, and turned the ordinary into something worth noticing. She was also, in her quiet way, deeply hopeful about love. She had dated in her 20s. Of course, there had been one man in particular, Marcus Reeves, a medical student she had met in college, who had made her feel like the most important person in any room they walked into together. Their relationship had been intense, genuine, full of long conversations and laughter, and the kind of easy intimacy that only comes when 2 people are completely themselves with each other. But they had been young and ambitious and pulled in different directions. Marcus had matched for a residency on the opposite coast. Maya had just launched her firm, and neither of them had been willing to ask the other to give something up, so they had let each other go. Maya had told herself for years that it was the right decision. That love alone was not enough when lives were moving in opposite directions. She had believed it, mostly. She had moved forward, focused on her work, built her business, and trusted that when the right person came along, she would recognize him. And then she met Daniel Hargrove. Daniel was everything that looked like the right person. He was 34, handsome in that sharp, expansive way that commanded rooms, the heir to a mid-sized real estate development company that his father had built and that Daniel was expanding aggressively. He was charming when he wanted to be, brilliantly, effortlessly charming, and in the beginning, he had turned all of that charm directly at Maya with an intensity that made her feel chosen, seen, wanted. Their courtship was a whirlwind. Dinners at restaurants she had only ever walked past. Weekend trips to cities she had read about in travel magazines. Flowers delivered to her office on random Tuesdays with handwritten notes. Daniel had a gift for grand gestures, and Maya had always been practical and careful. found herself swept up in the romance of it before she had a chance to examine it carefully. She met his family 6 months in. His mother, Eleanor Hargrove, was a tall, immaculately presented woman in her late 60s who had the particular brand of cold politeness that functions as a weapon. She shook Maya's hand, assessed her outfit, asked about her family background, with the careful neutrality of someone performing a background check, and then spent the rest of the dinner speaking exclusively to her son while directing pointed questions at Maya that were designed not to learn about her but to expose her. Insufficiency. Your design firm, is it profitable? My son is used to a certain lifestyle. You're not from this area originally, are you? Maya had smiled through all of it. She had been raised to be gracious in uncomfortable situations. Daniel had later told her she was imagining the tension, that his mother was just reserved, that she would come around. She never did. They were married 14 months after their first day. The wedding was beautiful, 200 guests, a venue that Daniel had chosen, a dress that his mother had quietly implied should be different than the one Maya had originally selected. Maya had changed the dress. She had told herself that compromise was part of marriage, that adjusting to her family's expectations was normal, that loving someone meant accepting all the pieces of them, including the complicated family they came with. She had not yet understood that she was not compromising. She was disappearing. The first year of marriage was a slow lesson in how much of herself she was expected to erase. Daniel did not ask her directly to close her firm. He simply made it inconvenient scheduling dinner parties that required her to leave the office by 4. Expressing quiet dissatisfaction when she worked late, suggesting once, and then twice, and then regularly, that it might be simpler if she focused on managing their home and attended to his professional, social obligations, which required a great deal of her time and energy as a wife. He phrased it as an opportunity. "You could be the most important person in every room I walk into," he said once, as though giving her a gift. She closed her firm 18 months into their marriage. She told herself it was temporary. She would relaunch when the time was right. She catalogued her client relationships carefully, kept her skills sharp, told herself this was just a pause. The miscarriages came in year 2. The first one at 11 weeks, quiet and brutal. The second at 9 weeks, 6 months later. Maya had mourned both privately, deeply, in the specific silence of a woman whose husband had not cried, had not held her through the nights that followed, had simply offered a stiff pat on the shoulder and suggested she speak to someone professional about her grief, as though her emotion was a scheduling problem to be delegated. She had held herself together because she did not know what else to do. And then, in the spring of her 3rd year of marriage, 3 things happened in rapid succession that changed everything. The first was a college reunion. The second was a late-night discovery on her husband's phone. The third was a pregnancy test. Maya had almost not gone to the reunion. She had not kept up with most of her college friends, and the version of herself she had been at 22 felt very far away from the woman she was now, quieter, more cautious, wearing the invisible weight of 3 years of slow separation. But her friend Sophia had begged. Sophia had been Maya's closest friend since their sophomore year. A bright, sharp, unfailingly honest woman who was one of the few people in Maya's life who had never pretended that Daniel was wonderful. "He turns the warmth off when no one important is looking," Sophia had said once, and Maya had defended him, but the sentence had never quite left her. She went to the reunion. Daniel was traveling for a real estate conference in Phoenix. He did not ask where she was going. He barely asked about her life in general anymore, and that was where she saw Marcos' 10 years had done nothing to diminish him. He was taller in presence than she remembered, a man now rather than a hopeful medical student, a cardiothoracic surgeon who carried himself with a particular quiet confidence of someone who had spent years making life and death decisions. With steady hands, he had gray at his temples. His smile was exactly the same. He had seen her from across the room and crossed it without hesitation. They had talked for 4 hours. About nothing important, old professors, shared memories, where they had ended up and how, and about everything important, in the careful way that 2 people speak when they know there is a great deal unsaid between them and they are not sure how much to say. He was not married. He had come close once, he said, but had ultimately understood that he had never fully let go of the feeling he associated with Maya, which was the feeling of being completely at ease with another person. Maya had not told him she was unhappy. She had told him she was married, because that was the truth, but she had listened to every word he said and felt, for the first time in years, like she was standing in sunlight. They had exchanged numbers at the end of the night, like old friends do. She had driven home at midnight, her heart unsteady in her chest, telling herself it was just nostalgia, just the comfort of someone who knew the person she used to be. 3 days later, she had been going through Daniel's phone looking for a restaurant reservation he had mentioned and found instead a folder of messages with a woman named Victoria Monsavem. Photographs. I miss you already. Can't wait until you're rid of her. You deserve so much better than what you're settling for at home. Maya had stood in a kitchen for a long time holding that phone. The refrigerator hummed out outside, a car passed on the street, inside her chest. Something that had been quietly breaking for 3 years simply finished breaking. She had set the phone down. She had poured herself a glass of water. She had not confronted Daniel that night because she had needed time to understand exactly what she was dealing with, not just the betrayal, but the calculated nature of it. Victoria's messages suggested an ongoing affair of at least 8 months. Daniel's responses were the responses of a man making plans, not a man making mistakes. When the timing is right, I need to do this properly. I need to protect the assets. First thought, he was not just cheating. He was positioning himself for divorce before she even knew there was going to be one. She had called Sophia the next morning and told her everything. And then she had called Marcus. She had not called him with intention. She had called him because she was drowning and he was the only person other than Sophia who felt like solid ground. They had talked for 3 hours. And at the end of the call, he had said quietly, I know this is complicated, Maya. I know you're going through something I can't fully understand right now, but I want you to know that if you ever need anything at all, I am here. She had not made a decision in that moment. She had only known that she was in a marriage that was already over, that had perhaps been over for longer than she wanted to admit, and that there was a man on the other end of that phone call who had once loved her completely and apparently never fully stopped. What happened next happened quietly. Over 2 weeks, conversations that grew longer had tried to see him, that she told herself was just friendship, a night that was not just friendship. She was not proud of the timing. She was not going to pretend the circumstances were clean or simple, but she was also not going to pretend that she had been anything other than alone in her marriage for years, or that what she had found with Marcus in those 2 weeks was not more genuine and tender than anything she had experienced with Daniel in 3 years. She had gone home and confronted Daniel 4 days after her night with Marcus. She had laid the phone messages on the table, printed, dated, organized the way her architect's mind organized everything, and she had looked at her husband and said, very calmly, I know about Victoria. I know what you've been planning, and I want a divorce. Daniel had stared at the pages for a moment, and then he had looked up at her with an expression she had never seen on his face before, not guilt, not shame, not the decency of a cot, man, but calculation. ARECALIBRATION. Fine, he had said. I'll have my lawyers call yours. She had missed her period 10 days later, and when the pregnancy test showed positive, Maya Chen had sat on the bathroom floor for a very long time, trying to understand how a life could become this complicated, this quickly. She had called Mark, she had told him. He had been quiet for a moment, and then he had said, I want to be in this child's life. Maya, I want to be in your life, whatever that looks like. We'll figure it out together. But there was a problem, a serious, terrifying problem. Daniel did not know about Marcus. As far as Daniel knew, the baby was his, and Daniel, cold, calculating Daniel, who had been positioning his assets for months, had suddenly discovered a new weapon. He had discovered that Maya was pregnant and had entirely reframed his divorce strategy around it. Suddenly, he was not the husband who wanted out. He was the wronged, devoted father fighting for his unborn child. His lawyers had reframed the entire narrative. Maya, they argued, was emotionally unstable, had no independent income, had no established career, was entirely financially dependent on Daniel, and was therefore unfit to be the primary custodial parent of a child who deserves stability, consistency, and the significant financial resources that only Daniel could provide. He had even convinced his mother to testify on his behalf. Eleanor Hargrove, who had spent 3 years making Maya feel like a guest in her own family, had taken the stand at a preliminary hearing and described her daughter-in-law as fragile, emotionally volatile, and financially irresponsible. She had used the word unsuitable twice. Her performance had been immaculate, and Maya's lawyer, a competent but underfunded woman named Angela, who was doing her best against Daniel's legal team of 4, had not been able to recover the damage. Maya could have told the truth. She could have disclosed that the baby might not be Daniel's, that a DNA test would clarify everything. But she had been advised by Angela not to raise the issue preemptively without evidence. That doing so without a test result in hand would be painted as a desperate attempt to avoid custody, and that the court would not look favorably on it without clean documentation. So she had waited, and the preliminary hearings had gone badly, and that was how she ended up in that courtroom. 7 months pregnant, watching a judge read terms that stripped her of nearly everything. The settlement, as it stood after that first major hearing, was devastating. The marital home, the one she had filled with plants and light, and carefully chosen furniture while Daniel traveled and attended to his affairs, was to be liquidated, with proceeds divided 60-40 in Daniel's favor on the basis that he had provided the down payment. The joint accounts, which had been frozen at Daniel's legal team's request citing contested asset origination, were to remain frozen pending a full financial review that his lawyers had ensured would take months. Maya's personal accounts, the modest savings she had built before closing her firm, were not frozen, but they were not substantial. Not substantial enough to sustain a single woman in the city, let alone a pregnant one preparing for a newborn. She had been awarded temporary housing assistance, a modest monthly payment while the divorce was finalized. She had been denied primary residential custody of the unborn child pending DNA confirmation and a post-birth custody evaluation, which meant that the moment her baby was born, Daniel intended to initiate a custody hearing. With his team of lawyers fully prepared, she had walked out of the courthouse into the gray afternoon and stood on the steps for a moment, feeling the wind and the weight of the situation in equal measure. Sophia had been waiting for her at the bottom of the steps. She had taken one look at Maya's face and stepped forward without a word, wrapping her arms around her as tightly as she dared around the pregnancy. "He is not going to win," Sophia said against her shoulder. "He is not going to take this baby. I promise you." Maya held onto her front and breathed slowly. "I know," she said, "but Sophia, I have to tell the truth. I have to do it now, before this goes any further." Sophia pulled back and looked at her carefully. "Marcus deserves to know what's happening, and the court deserves to know the truth. I can't keep letting Daniel fight for a baby that might not be his. It's not fair to anyone, not to Daniel, not to Marcus, and especially not to my child." There was a long pause. "Are you ready for what that does to this case?" Sophia asked. Maya looked down at her belly. She placed both hands on the curve of it, on the warm, solid reality of the child she had been protecting through all of this. Her child. Whatever happened next, this baby was hers. That was the only thing no court and no legal team and no amount of Eleanor Hargrove's testimony could change. "I've been trying to be strategic," Maya said quietly. "I've been trying to time things perfectly and protect myself. But the truth is the truth, and I'm done being afraid of it." She called Angela that evening and told her everything. About Marcus, about the timeline, about the night they had spent together before Maya had confronted Daniel, about Marcus's own willingness to be named as the potential biological father. Angela was quiet for a moment on the other end of the line, and then she said, in the measured voice of a lawyer recalculating, "This changes everything." Daniel received the formal notification through his legal team 3 days later. Maya had submitted a sworn declaration to the court disclosing that the biological paternity of the unborn child was uncertain, that there was at least one other potential biological father named and contactable, and that she was requesting an expedited prenatal paternity test to establish the truth before the custody proceedings continued. The notification landed at Daniel's office on a Wednesday morning. His assistant put it on his desk. His lead attorney called within the hour. By all accounts, Daniel's first response was laughter. Not disbelief, just laughter. The short, dismissive kind that men like Daniel use when they decide something is beneath their concern. "She's bluffing," he told his lawyer. "She's trying to complicate the custody case. It's a stalling tactic," his lawyer, a careful man named Graves who had worked with the Hargrove family for 15 years and had therefore witnessed Daniel's particular brand of arrogance in action before, chose his words precisely. "I would strongly recommend that we take this seriously, Daniel. If there is any possibility that she is telling the truth, there isn't," Daniel said. "The court will order the test regardless. Our response here matters. If we contest it aggressively and the test comes back negative, it won." Cinco quotes T. Daniel. There was a pause. Graves had been doing this long enough to know what it meant when a client was too certain. Not the certainty of a man who knew the facts, the certainty of a man who could not emotionally process the alternative. "I'll advise cooperation with the paternity test," Graves said finally. "And I'd recommend you prepare yourself for every possible outcome." Daniel had hung up the phone and sat at his desk for a long time, staring at the city below his office window. Around him, the machinery of the Hargrove development empire hummed efficiently. On the wall to his left was a framed photograph of himself at a ribbon-cutting ceremony for his largest development, shaking hands with the city mayor, smiling with the comfortable confidence of a man who had never had to reckon with a single thing he did not choose. He was not prepared for what was coming. He did not know how unprepared he was. But the court had already set the wheels in motion. The prenatal paternity test was performed at a genetics clinic across town on a Friday morning in November. Maya had arrived early, SophiaBsaito.com, in the specific way that people become calm when they have made peace with the truth and are simply waiting for it to be confirmed. The procedure was straightforward: a blood draw from Maya, a separate cheek swab from Daniel, and the submitted biological sample from Marcus that had been collected at his hospital under legal certification. Marcus had driven down from his practice 3 hours away. He had met Maya outside the clinic, and they had stood on the sidewalk in the cold morning air. Two people carrying the weight of an unusual situation with as much grace as they could manage. He had looked at her belly, with an expression that was impossible to misread. Not complicated, not conflicted, just full. The way a person looks when something they had resigned themselves to never having is suddenly, unexpectedly, real and present in front of them. "How are you feeling?" he had asked. "Like I've been holding my breath for 4 months, Maya said. He had nodded. "After today, you can start breathing." He had been right, though neither of them knew yet exactly how dramatically things were about to change. The results took 12 business days. Maya received them on a Tuesday morning by certified mail, along with a call from Angela. Maya. Angela's voice was careful, steady, deliberately measured. "The results are back. Tell me. Daniel Hargrove is excluded as the biological father of the child. Marcus Reeves is confirmed as the biological father with a probability exceeding 99.9%. Maya sat down on the edge of her bed. The apartment she was temporarily renting was small and sparse. Nothing like the home she had lived in with Daniel. But she had filled the windowsill with plants and hung one of her mother's prints on the wall and made it feel, in its small way, like hers. She sat there with the phone against her ear and felt something. Release inside her that had been clenched tight for months. Not just relief. Something cleaner. The particular feeling of truth finally being allowed to exist. "Okay," she said. "This effectively dissolves Daniel's custody claim," Angela said. "He has no biological or legal standing to pursue custody of a child that is not his. His entire case restructures dramatically. There's more." "What do you mean?" "His lawyers called me this morning, an hour before I called you. They want to settle. Quickly and quietly." The speed with which Daniel's position collapsed was breathtaking. One morning, he was a powerful man with a legal team of 4, a mother on the witness stand, and a narrative that painted Maya as unstable and unfit. The next morning he was a man who had spent tens of thousands of dollars fighting for custody of another man's child, a fact that was now part of the court record, accessible by anyone who cared to look. His lawyers pushed hard for a sealed settlement. Maya's lawyer pushed back. The negotiations took place over 4 days, during which Daniel apparently spent a great deal of time on the phone with his mother, who had her own adjustments to make to the story she had been telling herself, and others about her son's noble fight for his unborn child. Sophia, who had contacts in social circles that overlapped with the Hargroves, reported back that Eleanor had gone notably quiet, that the tight, satisfied smile had not been seen at the club, the charity luncheons, the gallery openings. She usually attended with the confidence of a woman who believed the world agreed with her assessment of her own importance. Meanwhile, Victoria, the woman for whom Daniel had been dismantling his marriage, had apparently learned about the DNA resolved through Daniel's legal circles and had made her own feelings known loudly and at length. A woman who had believed herself to be stepping into the role of the next Mrs. Hargrove, into a world of comfort and status and security, had discovered instead that the man she was stepping toward was currently in the process of professional and social humiliation, that the assets he had been so carefully positioning were now the subject of a litigation that was not going his way, and that the version of Daniel Hargrove she had fallen for bore almost no resemblance to the reality of who he was when things were not going according to his plan. She had ended things, reportedly, by text message. Sophia had found this information and delivered it to Maya with the particular satisfaction of a loyal friend, watching karma move at exactly the right speed. But the story was not finished, because what came out during the financial discovery portion of the divorce, the examination of both parties' assets that Daniel had believed would expose Maya's poverty relative to his wealth, turned out to be considerably more complicated than Daniel had anticipated. His lawyers had requested a full financial disclosure as part of their original strategy, intending to demonstrate the vast imbalance between Daniel's resources and Maya's, to establish that the child would be better served in Daniel's care from a purely economic standpoint. It had seemed to Daniel's team like a straightforward argument. What they had not known, what Daniel had not known, because he had spent their entire marriage treating Maya's professional history as background noise, was that when Maya clothed her landscape architecture firm, she had not simply dissolved it, she had sold it. Not the client list, not just the name, the intellectual property, the proprietary design methodology she had spent 6 years developing. A system for sustainable urban green space integration that had been quietly licensed to a larger architecture consortium 2 years earlier. The licensing agreement had been structured as a deferred payment arrangement, meaning that the bulk of the income had not yet materialized at the time of their marriage, and the asset itself had existed entirely before their union. Maya's attorney had, at the time of their marriage, properly filed this asset as premarital property. Daniel had signed off on the documentation without reading it, the way he signed off on most things related to Maya without reading them, because he had not believed she had anything worth examining carefully. The licensing payments, accumulated over 2 years and held in a business account in Maya's name from before the marriage, had matured that they were substantial, not Hargrove real estate substantial, but deeply, meaningfully, life-changing, substantial for a woman starting over, enough to retain a better legal team, enough to secure proper housing, enough to stand on her own feet completely, without a cent from Daniel, without the alimony she might have asked for, and which would have kept her tethered to his world and his lawyers for years. When the financial disclosure documents were filed and Daniel's legal team reviewed them, Graves had apparently gone very quiet for a long moment before picking up the phone to call his client. "She doesn't need your money, Daniel." A pause on the line. "She never needed your money. She has her own premarital, clearly documented, not subject to derision. Her lawyers are not asking for alimony. They are not asking for spousal support. They are asking for a clean separation with a fair division of the marital assets, including reimbursement for the professional income she demonstrably lost during the period of the marriage, during which she closed a business at your suggestion." Daniel had apparently said nothing for a very long time. "And the custody case," he said finally. "There is no custody case, Daniel. There is nothing left of the custody case." The final settlement hearing was nothing like the first one. Maya arrived with Angela and a second attorney from a firm she had retained with her own resources, a firm known for precision and a particular skill at protecting the interests of women in high-conflict divorces. She wore a dark green dress that her mother had mailed from across the state with a handwritten note that said, "You always looked beautiful in this color. Stand straight. We love you." She had read the note 4 times that morning. Daniel arrived with Graves and a team that had been carefully, quietly reduced, not in numbers, but in energy. The aggressive certainty they had brought to every previous hearing had been replaced by something more careful, more contained, the posture of people managing a situation rather than winning one. Eleanor Hargrove was not there. She had apparently decided that this was not a proceeding she wished to attend, and the terms of the final settlement were read into the record. The marital assets were divided, equitably, not 60-40 but fairly, with a specific provision crediting Maya for the professional losses she had incurred during the marriage. The marital home was liquidated, the proceeds divided, the frozen joint accounts were unfrozen. Maya walked away from the marriage financially whole, not wealthy by Daniel's standards, but whole, independent, unshackled. And Daniel, who had spent months positioning himself for the kind of victory that would have left Maya broken, and without resources, received nothing but what was rightfully his, minus the legal fees, minus the professional embarrassment, minus the narrative he had built around himself as the wronged party. He did not look at her when the judge concluded the proceedings. Maya looked at him. She wanted to see his face in this moment, not with malice, but because she needed to complete the chapter, to look at the man who had made her small and quiet, and afraid of herself for 3 years, and see him not as powerful, not as terrifying, but as what he actually was, a person who had overestimated himself and underestimated her so completely that he had never even bothered to understand what he was dealing with. He looked tired, smaller than she remembered, like a building that had been quietly losing its foundation for years and had finally settled into itself without drama or collapse, just diminished. She turned away and walked out into the afternoon. The baby was born on a Tuesday in January, 8 pounds, 2 ounces. The most perfect and complete thing Maya had ever experienced in her life. Arriving in the world with a full head of dark hair and eyes that seemed already to be assessing everything around them with quiet, unhurried intelligence, Marcus was there. He had driven through the night, arriving at the hospital 3 hours before she went into active labor, and he had sat beside her through all of it, not as a man performing a role, not as someone meeting an obligation, but as someone who wanted to be nowhere else in the world but exactly where he was. He held her hand when it was hard. He talked to her when she needed distraction. He cried when the baby was born, the clean, unself-conscious tears of a man whose heart had been opened by something larger than his capacity for restraint. They had named her Lily, because Maya had always believed that the most extraordinary things grew quietly in unexpected places toward the light out in the months that followed. The life that Maya rebuilt was not dramatic in its progress. It was quiet and steady and genuine, the kind of life that does not require anyone else's validation to feel real. She reopened her design practice, not in a frantic way of someone trying to prove something, but thoughtfully, one client at a time, one project at a time, with the particular intentionality of a person who had learned what it cost to abandon the things that made her herself. Her reputation had not disappeared during the years she had been Mrs. Hargrove. If anything, the colleagues who had known her before had simply been waiting for her return. Within 18 months, she had more work than she could comfortably handle alone, and she hired her first associate. Marcus came down from his practice every weekend that first year, and then, around the time Lily began pulling herself upright and looking at the world with enormous dark eyes, he began looking at properties in the city, and the weekend visits became less about travel and more about arrival. He transitioned his practice with characteristic efficiency, found a position at the city's largest hospital, and moved into the life that had been quietly assembling itself around him without requiring much more from him than the willingness to be present for it. He and Maya did not rush anything. They had spent enough time in circumstances they could not control. When they were ready, they moved in together. When they were certain, he asked her properly, not with a performance, not with an audience, but one evening at home with Lily, asleep down the hall and dinner getting cold on the table because neither of them was in a hurry to be anywhere else. She said yes without hesitation. Daniel Hargrove's story continued, as stories do, without Maya in it. Victoria was replaced, in time, by other women who found the shine wore off quickly once the performance of Daniel at his most charming gave way to the reality of Daniel at his most ordinary. The development company continued, competently, and without particular distinction. Eleanor Hargrove attended her club events and charity luncheons and said nothing publicly about the daughter-in-law she had dismissed and the grandchild she had lost any claim to through her son's choices. Daniel, by all accounts from people who moved in the circles he moved in, had become quieter in the years since the divorce. Less certain. The kind of man who had experienced something that would not resolve into a useful lesson because the lesson required an honesty with himself that he was not quite capable of. Perhaps, in time, he would manage it. Perhaps not. Some people require a very long time to understand that the most powerful thing they ever dismissed was not a possession or an opponent or a legal case, but a person. A complete, capable, generous person who had spent years trying to make their life together work, and who had finally, when there was nothing left to try, simply walked away and built something better. There is a photograph on Maya's office wall, not the new office, the good one, the one with the light-filled studio and the drafting table, and the wall of windows overlooking the park that she helped redesign the year before, but the one in her home. The small corner room she had made into a walk space for the nights, when Lily was asleep and she felt most like herself. The photograph is of her parents, her father with $40 in a suitcase, her mother with library books and double shifts standing in front of the house they eventually owned, looking directly into the camera with the particular expression of two people who have lived through enough difficulty to understand that the difficulty is not the point, that what matters is what you build from it. Maya had put the photograph there on the day she moved in, before the furniture was arranged, before the boxes were unpacked. She had hung it on the wall where she would see it every day, and she had stood in the empty room with the smell of fresh paint and the sounds of a new city and the low, distant cry of her daughter from the other room, and she had understood completely, finally, without reservation, that this was what her parents had been trying to give her all along. Not money, not security, not a husband from the right family or a position in the right world. The knowledge that you can lose everything and still be standing. The knowledge that some things cannot be taken from you, no matter how powerful the person trying. The knowledge that what belongs to you, truly, genuinely belongs to you, cannot be dissolved by a judge's ruling or a lawyer's filing or a cold man's contempt. Your life, your work, your child, your truth, these things are yours, and no divorce in the world can take them. What Daniel Hargrove never understood, and this, more than anything, is the cruelty of the kind of person he was, is that he never had Maya Chen at all. He had her compliance. He had her grace under pressure. He had her willingness to adjust and accommodate and reduce herself to fit into the life he was building. He had her at the dinner parties and the board gatherings and the family events where she smiled and made conversation and made him look like the kind of man who inspired loyalty and warmth in the people around him. But he never had the part of her that mattered. The part that designed spaces that made people feel alive in them. The part that had sat with her grief and her miscarriages and her loneliness and continued without bitterness, without cruelty, just continued. The part that had looked at a complicated and painful situation and chosen honesty over strategy, truth over self-preservation, because she understood at a cellular level what her parents had taught her, that integrity is not a tactic. It is the only thing that holds when everything else is removed. He never had that Maya. He had not known to look for her. He had seen a woman he could shape, and she had been too gracious, for too long, to disabuse him of the notion. And to morning she put the printed messages on the kitchen table and said, very calmly, I want a divorce. That morning, the real Maya Chen had finally, irrevocably shown up, and everything that followed the courtroom, the test results, the settlement, the new firm, the small apartment that became a home, the child who grew up knowing both, where she came from and exactly who would show up for her, was the natural consequence of a woman refusing, finally, to be less than she was. The last time Maya saw Daniel was by accident, a year after the divorce was finalized, that she was in the atrium of the city's new botanical center, a project she had been commissioned to design, one she had spent 18 months on, a space where the boundaries between indoors and outside dissolved in a way that made you feel held and open at the same time. It was opening day. There were perhaps 300 people in the space. Lily, 14 months old, was on Marcus's hip, already reaching for the flowers with the focused determination of someone who had identified exactly what she wanted and was entirely confident in her right to have it. Daniel had come with a client, apparently. She saw him before he saw her. He was standing at the far end of the atrium, looking up at the vaulted glass ceiling and the living wall of plants that climbed 40 feet from floor to ceiling, the centerpiece of the project. The thing that had made every person who saw it stop and simply breathe for a moment. He looked up at it and then looked around, and his eyes found the placard on the wall near the entrance, the one that read, Botanical Atrium designed by Maya Chen, Chen Landscape. Architecture. She saw the moment he registered it, the stillness, the recalibration of the expression on his face, the look of a man encountering something he did not expect and was not entirely prepared to process, and then he turned and found her standing 20 feet away, watching him. Their eyes met. Maya Chen, who had spent 3 years trying to fit herself into the shape of someone else's idea of her, and who had spent 2 years since then expanding back into herself, stood completely still and felt nothing complicated. Not anger, not triumph, not the satisfaction of revenge, which had never been what she was after, just the clean, uncomplicated feeling of two people seeing each other clearly for the first time. Of a chapter complete, she nodded, once the quiet, gracious acknowledgement of a woman who had nothing left to prove and nothing left to defend. Asterisk, and then she turned back to her family. To Lily reaching for flowers with both hands and Marcus laughing at the reach of her. To the space she had created out of her own vision and her own hands and her own unshakable refusal to become nothing. She walked toward them without looking back. Some doors, when they close, lock behind you. Not as punishment, As protection. As confirmation. You are no longer that person in that life. You are this person in this one. And this one with all its difficulty, all its complexity. All the nights that tested you and the mornings you chose to keep going anyway. This one is yours. Asterisk fully. Finally. Completely. Yours. If this story moved you, if you've ever been underestimated by someone who didn't understand your worth, let us know in the comments below. Subscribe for more stories that remind you what's meant for you cannot be taken from you. We'll see you in the next one.